Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 241, Social Psychology. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 13, and we're going to talk about aggression. So in terms of announcements, nothing really too new, though do remember you have a final paper that is going to be due at the end of the semester. Don't forget about that. It is significantly longer than the other papers. I don't want you guys to be kind of blindsided by that. So in terms of where we're going today, talking about aggression, we're going to talk about how we harm others, why we harm others, when we choose to harm others, and then we're going to talk about how we can reduce harm. So again, this is kind of an interesting chapter, again, given what we talked about in Chapter 12 on groups and what we'll talk about in Chapter 14 on altruism or pro-social behavior, because this comes down to the question of, right, are people good? Are people bad? Why do we act aggressively? Why do we act kindly? And these two chapters, I think, go hand in hand. But let's start out by talking about how we harm others. And to do this, I'm going to have you do a couple questions here, just a yes or no set of questions. And what I want you to do is tell me if any of these are acts of aggression, yes or no. So the first one I'm going to ask about is, if a spider eats a fly, is that an act of aggression? Yes or no? Two, if a jealous man kills his wife and her lover, is that aggression? How about a prison warden executing a criminal, a depressed person who commits suicide, a man who mentally rehearses a murder but doesn't do it, a hunter who kills an animal for a trophy, and then finally, 7, a Girl Scout who tries to assist an elderly woman across the street but trips her on accident. So go through these and look. Which of these are considered aggression? So with that, go ahead and pause the video and we will move on to the next slide. So with your answers in mind, you probably had some sense of what you think these aggressive behaviors would be. And how we define aggression in social psychology is an intentional behavior aimed at causing physical harm or psychological pain to another person. So intentionally causing some type of malice, whether that be physical, mental, theoretically social pain as well. All of these are aggression. But we can break it down even more. The first type we can talk about is hostile aggression. So aggression stemming from feelings of anger and usually aimed at inflicting pain or injury. So, right, this could be, right, something where we are talking about being actually an intention to harm people. So notice that this is motivated by things like anger and hostility and genuinely wanting to hurt another person, and inflict pain in that way. But we can also talk about instrumental aggression. Aggression is useful, right? Aggression is a means to a goal sometimes. So for instance, right, playing football, we wouldn't necessarily say, is not aggressive, but it's not that kind of hostile aggression. These people aren't trying to beat up each other because they're angry. That is just kind of the way of the game. For instance, if you've seen the opening scene of The Godfather, I believe it's the opening scene or one of the early scenes, where they leave a horse head in the person's bed to get that person to comply. That's an example of instrumental aggression, right? That is causing some kind of psychological pain on somebody, but to get them to do something. And then lastly, we can talk about relational aggression. So aggression that harms people through the manipulation of relationships. So, right, maybe talking about somebody behind their back. So all of these are types of aggression that we can talk about. But beyond that, right, do you think there are gender differences in emotion? Well, we know that men are more likely to use hostile aggression. And as we know that based on some previous stats, which these have likely changed, and I haven't found the updated ones, men account for 99% of rape and 88% of murder arrests, right? Much more hostile aggression. But we do know that comparatively, women tend to use more relational aggression, being willing to kind of argue against one another and kind of turn people against each other. Now, this does not mean that women are not or cannot be hostilely angry, and this does not mean that men cannot use relational aggression. Right? These are completely usable by both genders. We're just talking about what typically seems to be more average. But there are some other factors, right? Are you provoking somebody? Things like culture will matter, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well here. Right, think about how anger and aggression kind of manifest themselves, and how, right, these are not exactly, right, it's not super cut and dry. What maybe causes somebody to be angry or aggressive might be something that somebody else lets roll off their back, right? So there's a lot of other factors here. But when we talk about why we harm others, there are legitimate reasons to be aggressive. One argument we can talk about is an evolutionary argument. Another being a cultural argument, a socialization argument, or a motivational argument. So why do we harm others? Well, let's talk about these 4 different arguments or theories why we might harm others. But before we do that, I have a second VLQ for you. So given that we're still in the COVID world today, do you think people have been more aggressive since the onset of COVID-19 measures? And I know this is going to lead to some bias in terms of what you remember and not, but do you think generally people have been more aggressive? And what do you think people are doing or not doing that you might have expected to happen in a situation like this? So take a moment and answer that question. Okay, so moving on, why do we harm others? The first argument we're going to talk about is the evolutionary argument. And this idea is that physical aggression is really useful, right? The Hulk manages to use physical aggression to, right, do lots of things that men can do, probably to a lesser extent than the Hulk, such as defend their group, right? Secure what we call high status and get the best mate. If you think of bucks, for deer, they typically will fight one another to achieve a higher status, become the dominant one of the group, and that is also a kind of way that the mating order goes in cultures like that. There's animal cultures, that is. Or protect their mate and ensure paternity is another reason. Now, there's also this question about the relationship with testosterone, that men might be more physically aggressive because of testosterone. Well, it's important to be clear that there is a small relationship, that more testosterone typically leads to more aggression. But this is not a guaranteed thing, right? And it's also a small relationship. This is not that men are super more likely to be aggressive just because they have more testosterone than women. This is not like if I give you an injection of testosterone, you're just going to Hulk out. No, this is not the case. And this also comes to, right, a question, right, innate or learned. So for things like cats and rats or chimps or bonobos, is aggression just typically learned? Well, when they did a study looking at 20 cats raised in isolation, 11 of the 20 cats did not attack rats when they were first introduced to them, suggesting that maybe part of this aggression, which, right, it's aggressive to kill and eat a rat, but it's also, right, human nature, or I guess animal nature, cat nature, but it's not necessarily a required thing. So would we say that the the evolutionary argument totally covers this idea? I would not, because we know that these rats and cats are able to live together in harmony without necessarily this always being an innate drive to be aggressive. So that's the evolutionary argument. However, we also have things like the cultural argument that, right, we do have the capacity for aggression, but culture teaches us when, how, and where, when, whether we should use this or not, and how to do so. I think I said a lot of those variables or, right, things twice there, so I apologize. But what's very interesting is this idea, we often hear it called the culture of honor, right? That certain regions in the United States have a higher amount of kind of desire to be honorable. And you see this in the homicide rates of white male offenders, actually, that in the South, there typically is this strong increase in the homicide rates compared to other regions. And what we see is that when it comes to felony-related murders, so things that maybe are more focused on another crime that happened, there's really no difference between non-South and people from the South in terms of how often this happens. But notice, when we talk about arguments or murders that have come due to arguments between people, the South and the Southwest have a much higher murder rate when it comes to this. So this is really strange. And what we can think about here is, again, this idea that maybe the South has what is known as a culture of honor. And a culture of honor is a culture that's defined by its members' strong concern about their own and their other reputation. This is mostly focused on a reputational thing, on an honor system. So the culture of honor seems to lead to a hypersensitivity towards insults and a willingness to use violence to avenge perceived slights that might happen to you. This is one thing I learned about living in Texas is people really get upset if you're threatening their honor. You're threatening things like their family, who they are, their house. We see that people from the South typically get angrier faster because of this, that there are these kind of cultural norms for Southern individuals here. And one study actually looked at this, and this was by Cohen and a couple colleagues. It's called the Hallway Study. So I love this study because it's pretty great. It's a great way to look at how to promote aggression and how to maybe measure people's differences in terms of this. So in the Hallway Study, what they did was they had people from the South and the North complete some measures, and then they were asked to bring those measures out and walk down a hallway and hand them in at the end. And what they did was they took a Confederate who walked by this person and bumped shoulders with them and called this person an asshole. So imagine that you're finishing up your study, you're walking down a narrow hallway, somebody bumps you in the shoulder, and goes, "Watch out, watch where you're going, asshole," and then continues down. So they looked at Southerners versus Northerners. A Confederate bumps in the participant, calls the participant asshole. And what was funny is then afterwards they completed one more measure about anger. And it was anger versus amusement. And 80% of Southerners reported feeling more angry about this situation than amused. But the Northerners, about 60% of them reported more amusement than anger. So as somebody from the North, I think it would be funny if somebody called me an asshole. It's like, weird. Why would you do that? Okay. But from the South, it typically seems that individuals take that more personally, and take it as against their honor or who they are. So we do see that this does happen, and I think it's a very interesting thing to consider regarding this argument, because there's another study too looking at this, and this is back a little bit more related to when I talked about felony-related murders to argument-related murders a couple slides ago. So in the letter study by Cohen and Nisbet, they sent letters from theoretical job applicants, the authors of the study did. And they said that these job applicants that they were sending out were jailed for murder versus motor vehicle theft. So one variable is murder versus motor vehicle theft. And what they did was they were asked to explain in the what would you call that, in the job application, why they went to jail. And so for the murder condition, you see people say, "I got into a fight with someone who was having an affair with my fiance. He laughed in my face and asked me to step outside if I was man enough. We got into a tussle. He was killed, and I've been in jail because of that." On the other hand, they use this theft condition. "I have no excuse. I had a wife and kids, and by stealing, I was able to give them what I needed. I was desperate." And what they did was they sent these two types of job applications out to Southerners and Northerners. And what you see is that for the Southerners, Southerners were more sympathetic than Northerners to people in this condition of the murder. However, there was no difference in the theft condition. So I ask, why do you think there's a culture of honor in the South? And I do want to bring this up in class because there was a very strong culture of honor in the South when I was down there, when I was down in Texas, but I don't really know if there's one in Florida, given the fact that coronavirus and I don't get to see people much anymore. Make sure you're able to come to class and answer that question, especially those of you who are native Floridians. Now, another thing we can talk about is this idea of the precarious manhood hypothesis. And this is really something that I kind of implicitly knew growing up as a man in America, but I'd never heard this described, is the idea that a man's gender identity based on strength and toughness, right? Men are supposed to be strong and tough. And men might feel that they lose that perception of being strong and tough under certain conditions, and being not strong or not tough for a man might be a way that triggers aggressive behavior as a way to make this up. So it's saying things like man up. And when we look at perceived social expectations or societal expectations of young men, 70% of young men expect society thinks them to act strong. 35%, over a third of them, think that they should use violence to get respect. Over half of them say that society expects them never to say no to sex, and almost 2/3 of them think that if they are acted aggressively upon, they should be aggressive back. And how we see this often is that men are socialized to avoid gender inappropriate behavior. And punishment for doing gender inappropriate behavior typically is more severe than when women or young girls are doing gender inappropriate behavior. And we do see, actually, some research shows that men are more likely to engage in risky behaviors after feeling threatened based on their gender. And so I ask this question almost facetiously, Is putting your health and safety at risk manly? And the reason, so answer that, but also when you see this picture below, why does stuff like this happen and what can we do, So here we see the New York Post said that there's evidence to support this based on what we've talked about, that men are less likely to wear face masks during COVID because they're, quote, not cool and, quote, a sign of weakness. And I love Philip Henry's kind of response here. Is it, he's saying that this is considered stereotypically feminine and suggesting that that is kind of being gay. I would say that that's not exactly the most appropriate way to put this, but I think it is kind of a facetious way to say, is it really that wrong to wear masks? And why do we see this? So go ahead and pause the video and answer that question as well. So the next type we'll talk about of argument is the socialization argument. And this comes back to social learning theory, we've already talked about with Bandura a little. So we learn social behavior in large by just observing what other people do, and we imitate them. We might model other people's behaviors. When kids kind of model what their parents do, we might observe what other people do and learn through that. We might be vicariously conditioned. We might watch somebody else do something. For instance, if you have a sibling who cusses in front of mom and gets their mouth washed out with soap, you can pretty quickly learn, hey, I shouldn't do that. So who are our sources of learning and how does this work, So we'll spend some time talking about this. I'm not going to show the Bandura's Bobo doll experiment because I believe we've already done this in class, but the idea being that children who watched an aggressive adult beat up on Bobo over here typically were more likely to behave in aggressive acts towards Bobo when they got the chance, suggesting that they are learning from what parents do as well, that we're socialized towards this. Now, one study that I found to be really cool regarding this is this study on Bible stories and violence. So what they had individuals do in 2007 was read a violent passage. So this was either from the Bible or from an ancient scroll. And this was the same exact story. And the only other thing they talked about was whether God sanctioned this violence, whether it be God from the Bible or God from this ancient scroll, or whether God did not sanction this violence. This was done at BYU, Brigham Young University, which is I believe it's a Mormon university out in Utah, and it is very religious. So again, we are taking people who are religious, talking about these Bible passages versus these ancient scroll passages, and whether or not God said the violence was okay to happen. So after reading that, individuals took part in a noise blast task where they worked against another person in a competitive task to kind of answer questions as fast as possible. And if you lost, you were able to blast a noise in their ears and you controlled the volume. So again, this noise blast task is a way to kind of be aggressive and shoot loud kind of white noise in people's ears or quiet white noise. So what we see is that based on belief in God in the Bible, right? All of these people supposedly believe in God going to BYU, right? It is a religious school. When God sanctioned the violence, we see that people were more likely to be aggressive and use louder volume here for this being in the Bible, right? When this is not the Bible here, when this is just an ancient scroll, we see a big decrease here. And when God sanctions the violence, again, there is a big increase. For both of these conditions are actually significant. However, when there's no mention of God for the violence, right, this didn't really matter. And what was interesting is they did break this down by people who were religious believers and those who weren't, and it really actually didn't show any differences. That even non-believers typically had, or non-religious people had increases in aggression for studies that mention God-sanctioned violence, which is also interesting. Another reason we might harm others is through, right, these idea of how we're motivated to do things. And one really famous theory is this idea of the frustration aggression theory by Dollard and colleagues. And the idea behind this is more or less that, right, well, you can almost call it the Hulk effect, that when we become frustrated, which happens because we are unable to meet a goal, right, we might get really angry. So frustration comes from blocking a goal-directed behavior. Say you've been really excited to go home and, right, watch a new show that came out on Netflix, and you've been super excited about that. You get home and you're about to sit down, and then your mom says, hey, you got to come clean your room and, right, come help us with dinner first. You were so close to achieving your goal of watching this new Netflix show, you're probably going to be a little upset, if not more than a little upset, because you're blocked from doing what you want to do. And this perception that we're being prevented from attaining your goal increases these aggressive responses, actually, believe it or not. So one example of this, right, is imagine that you are leaving a football game at Texas A&M, one of the biggest stadiums in the country. I've done this before, and it's awful. And say you get into traffic, right? Now, you're probably going to start to get frustrated because it's been a long day, you've done a lot of cheering, you're ready to go home, and you just don't want to be stuck in traffic anymore. So when this happens, you might increase that kind of aggressive response, getting more and more angry. I know I tend to stew when I'm stuck in traffic and getting upset. And this, right, theoretically, if we don't find some way to taper this off, could lead to something like road rage, but doesn't always. Another example of this was Barker and colleagues. All they did was they brought kids into this room in front of all of these toys. And they either put kind of a wire screen in front of them where kids couldn't reach the toys, or they said, yeah, go ahead and play right now. And when these kids weren't able to play, you actually saw them get really aggressive and start to like break down the wire mesh screen to get to it. And so I always found this really funny because this happens even with children, and children, right, start to throw tantrums in the same way that maybe grown adults do sometimes. But what's interesting about this in this motivational argument is that we see that not all frustration is the same based on this puzzle study. So what they did was they brought in people to complete a very difficult puzzle. And so there were 4 different conditions. In the no frustration condition, the control condition, participants were able to complete a solvable puzzle, though it wasn't super easy. And so we see that these individuals, right, aren't very frustrated. I will say for our y-axis on the left here, the mean number of shocks, this was after the study, they were asked to do a similar kind of game, but instead of ear blasting, it was a small electrical shock, nothing like Milgram, again, just kind of a quick little one. And we saw how many times you would shock the other person. So in the no frustration condition, not a lot of shocks happened. In the frustration condition, the jigsaw puzzle was actually unsolvable. They didn't give them enough pieces, or things just didn't make sense. And so this is going to cause you to be more frustrated because you can't seem to fix it. And so we see more shocks coming later as a result of that. There's a personal frustration condition, right? The jigsaw puzzle was solvable, but a Confederate kept interfering. The person who they actually got to shock kept interfering and right, causing them to not really be able to solve it. And lastly, the fourth condition, a participant finished the puzzle, but the Confederate suggested that the puzzle maybe wasn't that difficult and right, they shouldn't be that impressed. And those people who said mean things to the participant, right, like pretty aggressively, not even passive aggressively, they were the most likely to be shocked. And to have shocks more often delivered to them, which makes sense, right? That it's one thing to be frustrated because you can't complete a task. It's another thing to be frustrated and kind of insulted or humiliated. And that's going to actually increase our frustration and make us more likely to act aggressively to get that frustration out. But, right, what are some things that actually increase how much frustration is experienced? One or a couple of things here, right? The desirability of the goal. Is this something you really, really, really want to do, or is this something that can wait? Right? How close are you to achieving the goal? Are you right about to finally achieve a goal that you've been working towards for years? Or is this something that, you're still a long ways off on? How much of the goal is being blocked? Did you only lose out on a little bit of something? Did you lose out on everything? How often is a goal progress blocked? So is this something that people keep interrupting you for and it makes it more difficult? Or is this right, something that more or less you've only been interrupted with a few times? Now, one thing to note that's a real critique of this is that aggression is not always the result of frustration. We can become aggressive for other reasons. We don't have to be frustrated. And we know that, right, frustration doesn't always actually lead to aggression either. So if we think about this, hostile aggression can arise from things like heat, pollution, and we'll talk about a couple of these. Instrumental aggression is often not due to blocked goals, but it's used for another reason. So, right, a frustrated football player may be more likely to be quick on a tackle, but if they're not frustrated, they're still likely to act aggressively here. And additionally, frustration can lead to things like anger, annoyance, or readiness to aggress if the situation is right. However, it doesn't necessarily mean you are going to act aggressively. I could sit in my car and be upset that I'm stuck in traffic, but I won't necessarily get out and start beating people up. Another example of the motivational argument is what we call the scapegoat theory. So a scapegoat is some kind of other entity in which we can blame things on, right? So if you are mad at your spouse, for instance, right, you might take it out on somebody else like the dog or, a friend instead, when we can, when we can kind of push the aggression off as an easy target. And one study looked at this in the 1940s, and this was really looking at the relationship between the price of cotton and the lynchings of African Americans in the South from 1882 till 1930. As it turns out, there's a strong negative correlation between the price of cotton and the number of lynchings. As the price of cotton went down, right, and the economy got worse, lynchings began to rise. So why does this happen, right? As cotton prices go down, lynchings began to rise. Why would this happen? Frustration leads to generalized aggression, but sometimes we can't necessarily point that. Worse economy and lower prices of cotton is a very frustrating thing for people whose livelihoods depend on that. But it's not maybe the thing that comes to mind first as to why you're aggressive or why you're upset. So this might make you push that aggression onto something else. In this case, it was African Americans, right, who are typically powerless against these groups of a lynch mob, for instance, and recognizing that this is another way that aggression happens, where most of us are probably not exactly happy about being in COVID times here, but maybe that's part of the reason people are a little bit shorter to one another now and seem to be just aggressive overall. But that's enough talking about why we harm others. Let's talk about when we choose to harm others. Well, one way that we can choose to harm others is, right, to be provoked. When another person provokes us with aggression, we typically reciprocate. of the most likely causes of murder, arguments tend to be at the top of this, right? That when we are provoked, we tend to aggress at the and match that level of perceived attack. So if somebody's yelling at you, you might be more likely to yell back. If somebody comes at you swinging, you're probably going to start swinging yourself. But there are some important factors. If I accidentally swing my arm out and hit you in the head, you probably won't get super aggressive as soon as I apologize because it wasn't intentional, right? So we can accidentally be hit and be hit hard enough to hurt. And we might get angry for a second, but when we see somebody go, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that, we typically cool off. There might be mitigating circumstances, right? So we must be aware of at the time of insult. So for instance, right, if your friend starts making fun of you in a way that might hurt you if it's somebody else, you might know it's a friend and they're just kidding. And this decreases some of those circumstances of aggression. And when we talk about this provocation, one study looked at this regarding how we aggress to match level of perceived attack. So this was a reaction time game. You had to click as fast as you could, and when you lost versus another player, you were shocked. And they had a Confederate complete this task as well, and I think it was actually just a computer Confederate, to be quite honest. And what they did is they had 4 conditions. A condition where the Confederate or computer constantly gave a high level of shock after they won. They had a condition where the computer or this Confederate gave a low level of shock after the participant lost. An increasing shock in the third condition, so kind of rising as we go, and then a decreasing shock, starting at the top and then lowering as we went. So I'll just show you this kind of set of trials here, and what we're looking at, each of these bars, is actually how the human player, the participant, responded in kind after having a shock against them. So in the high attack or the high shock condition, right, they got a high voltage right out the gate. So they attacked back in turn. I'm going to give you a high level of voltage. Now this kind of increased as we went along, as people realized, oh, so you're not going to play kindly with me, I'm going to be rude. In the low shock condition, people, right, began a little bit higher and started going lower and lower as time went on. Again, kind of reacting in kind. And what's really cool is the increasing shock conditions, it seems like somebody realized, or people realized, hey, you're going to be a jerk, I'm going to crank up the heat as well, especially between trials 2 and 3. Decreasing shock, we see kind of the opposite effect where people are lowering their level of aggression. Again, all of this suggests that how we are provoked and what level somebody attacks us, quote unquote, at often determines how we attack back. But beyond that, what's a very interesting one to me, and this always surprises me, is that heat can actually lead to more aggression. And think about some of the things we say. My blood is boiling. He's so hot-headed. All of these things related to warmth and heat. We know that there are correlations between heat and crime. Determining the temperature of how of it outside often leads to more crime. Now, this is also controlling for the fact that, right, people are maybe more outside during summer. We know that heat waves actually are more likely to be related to violent crimes. Not necessarily nonviolent crimes, but heat tends to be related to violent crimes. And what we see is that for people in cars without air conditioning, they tend to honk more than in traffic than individuals who have air conditioning. And these were for cars in Arizona, actually. With sports, for MLB, pitchers hit more batters on hot days than on days that were colder. The interesting to note is that this didn't correlate with number of walks. This was specifically the number of batters that were hit, suggesting that people maybe are a little more aggressive. One other study that I really love talks about room temperature and just putting people in a 90-degree room, which seems like a really fun idea as a researcher to take a test. And people are more likely to be hostile to a stranger in a 90-degree room than they are in rooms that are more kind of room temperature. I guess any room is room temperature, though. But So why does heat make us aggressive? Well, think about it, right? The frustration aggression theory, we get uncomfortable and cranky, which causes us to be aggressive. This increases physiological arousal, our fight or flight. And more specifically, though, our fight aspect of this. And we might misattribute this arousal to other situations. So we might not recognize that it's the heat, and we might think it's what somebody says to us. And we have strong mental associations between anger and heat. You know, there are different kind of things, right? When people get hot, it primes the emotion of anger, just like how smiling can make you feel happier. But, right, is there something special about heat? Well, it's related to bodily discomfort, right? Pain, humidity, pollution, crowds, odor, these are all kind of related to heat, and they're things that often we don't like, possibly making us cranky. But, right, though we can go ahead and sit in an ice bath or use a cold presser task, which actually lowers the threshold for aggressive behavior, makes people less likely to be aggressive. So heat does seem to make people aggressive. Now, though, do you know that alcohol can also lead to more aggression? And why does this happen? Well, it reduces our inhibitions. Maybe you're more likely to say something you shouldn't. Maybe you're more likely to do something you shouldn't. It disrupts our information processing. And what we mean by that is we kind of stop overriding some aggressive impulses. It impairs, planning, control components of the brain, and we might miss subtleties and focus on obvious things instead. There's also this idea of alcohol myopia just meaning less aware and more de-individuated. There's this interesting thing called the think-drink effect as well. Right? Expectations about alcohol, typically that it makes us more likely to be aggressive, causes us to be more aggressive, and it also influences behavior actually more than the alcohol or the amount of alcohol that you drink. In terms of alcohol and relationship conflict, in 3 conditions, a placebo, an alcohol condition, and a control condition, they had individuals take part of a level of negativity survey about their current relationship. And what you see is that people who are intoxicated typically seem to be more negative towards both themselves and their partner than people who are sober. So again, alcohol, the cause and solution of all of life's problems, as Homer would say, maybe isn't exactly that. So when do we cause harm? Well, one thing we can do is, as we mentioned before with provocation, we can think about aggressive cues as well. Now, these aren't necessarily what people are doing to us, but actually just objects that are associated with aggressive responses can increase aggression. Weapons, just having weapons, specifically guns, can impact behavior. In a Berkowitz study, evaluation and shocking was what they were looking at. They made some students angry and gave them a chance to shock a partner, again, using this kind of shock paradigm. But in some of the rooms, they had guns, I love how it's written for me. Some of them were made angry in a room which contained a gun that was left lying around, ostensibly from a previous experiment. Not sure why we're leaving guns around in a room here. But on the other condition, they use a tennis racket. And what's so interesting, or a badminton racket, is we see that in the anger conditions, guns typically make people more likely to act aggressively. But not only that, in the no anger conditions, we see that having guns still leads to more aggressiveness than badminton rackets. So again, something interesting to be looking at here. But Bartholomew and a couple colleagues found this interesting finding with hunters, that hunters don't see these guns as aggressive. Why? Well, it's pretty easy when you think about it. These hunters are using guns as tools, not as aggressive weapons. While it may be aggressive, to shoot and kill an animal by the definition of aggression, it's not exactly out of malice. It's more out of, if you're a hunter who's doing this for food, right, for just the natural life cycle. We can also talk about things like media violence. The question I have here, it's a VLQ, which I didn't actually write up top, so another VLQ for you. Do you think that violent TV, music, and video games makes people more aggressive? Yes or no? And with that question, what we see is there tends to be some correlation between this, but it's no more than like a 0.15 correlation. It's no more likely to make you be aggressive than being male, having prior physical violence of. It's less aggressive, or it's less likely to correlate with aggression than things like being part of a gang. But the other question is, right, if watching violent TV, or violet TV, excuse me, versus playing violent video games. A professor at this university, why can't I think of his name? Chris Ferguson, Dr. Chris Ferguson. He studies violence and aggression in terms of video games. And we see that video games do have an increased aggressive actions in hypothetical situations, but not actual situations. People might talk a big game, but they won't really do anything any more severe. But with violent media, we know there are some things with violent media. That violent media can increase intimidation or imitation, of specific aggressive acts, right? Like, oh, that's how you do it. So now I know, right? Through observational learning. This can reduce inhibitions, right? If they can do it, so can I. Increase perceptions of the world as a violent place. If we see people acting violently, we might think, right, if we think back to the representativeness heuristic or the availability heuristic, we might think that that's how the world is. We might increase endorsement of violence to solve social problems. Maybe we should take out this group of people in order to fix things. Or, right, maybe we should just do X, Y, or Z that's aggressive. Misattribution of arousal to anger. So we might not realize that we're just having a stressful day, and we might attribute that to being angry instead. And lastly, this actually desensitizes people to the severity of violence, right? When we see things like, right, people being shot in the head on, right, the nightly TV, if we watch some shows, that's suggesting some pretty negative things. And lastly, this all tends to decrease empathy for victims of violence. They probably deserved it. Things like that will often be said. And with aggressive cues, right, we can talk about this increase to the violent media aggressive behavior link. If we identify with the people we're watching on TV, who are acting violently, we're more likely to act violently. If we focus on the violence specifically, instead of it being a tool or, right, a plot device, if the violence is justified, right, against criminals or seems to be reasonable, we might increase our feeling violent. Does this really mean that TV makes you more violent? Very doubtful. These are all short-term effects. Think back to priming. They don't last long. Lastly, how do we reduce harm? And how I ask that is, how do we reduce aggressive behavior? How do we stop this based on what we talked about? So go ahead, take a moment and answer that as well. Well, one thing you might have thought about was punishing aggressive behavior to reduce further aggression. Well, what we see is that punishers model aggressive behavior. So if we, right, spank a kid, right, this might induce that person to imitate that action. The important thing is a threat of mild punishment. So this has to be powerful enough to get a child to stop an undesired activity, and then the child must be able to justify his or her restraint as an attitude change. So think back to changing attitudes. So in the forbidden toy experiment, what they did was they said, if you, right, touch Elmo here, who is forbidden to be touched, right, we're going to tell your parent and something bad is going to happen. Right, they don't necessarily say what it is, but having that is enough for a child to say, okay, so I don't actually want Elmo because it's not worth it. But harsh punishment, on the other hand, might actually backfire for children, especially if it doesn't model appropriate behavior. So, right, you probably shouldn't be punching your kids, and that's not going to really work with kids. Now, what's also interesting, though, is for adults. This can act as a deterrent if it is swift and certain that we are reducing this punishment. So what do we mean by that? We are talking about more or less like if you are doing something, right, aggressive and you immediately get kind of tackled and thrown in jail for it, that is going to be very useful as a way to deter this. But if it doesn't happen right away, it doesn't really seem to decrease aggression. There's this idea of catharsis, being able to just get this out of our system. Maybe we'll just go beat something up like a pillow and then we'll feel better. Does this actually reduce the need for further aggression? No, actually. Catharsis is not the answer. There's no evidence that purging emotions reduces harmful behavior. Conventional wisdom suggests that, this is that this should work, but we know it doesn't. Oops, lots of stuff there. So, with video games and violence in playing sports, right? We see that this doesn't necessarily decrease aggression after people are already aggressive. What about watching aggressive games? Well, will that reduce aggressive behavior? No. Right? Watching aggression also increases aggression. So all of these are ways to actually kind of increase aggression rather than decrease it. As we mentioned before, though, we can reduce heat to decrease aggression, right? Turn on the AC when it's hot outside, stand in front of a fan, consume foods and drinks that are cool, use kind of simple devices like counting to 10, taking deep breaths, engaging in distracting activities. All the stuff they taught us back in when we were kids actually do work here. What's also, I think, a really powerful thing is just communicating. Simply having adversaries meet face-to-face can reduce conflict. Here we see Bill Clinton. I think this is between Israel and Palestine, some talks that they had, and this was a way to hopefully decrease this tension because, as we talked about in the last chapter with de-individuation, we can't be de-individuated if we're sitting there looking at somebody. It's much kind of better to enable us to gain insight into ourselves and the dynamics of a relationship. And it's mostly working if this anger is non-violent and non-demeaning. So if you come together with this person at the table and they start insulting you, well, you're out of luck. This isn't going to be useful anymore. If they're demeaning, if they're rude, if they're violent, this is not very useful. So we can also talk about reconciliation. So how do we reconcile when we maybe make somebody aggressive or cause some kind of harm on somebody and they're maybe aggressive? Well, right, take full responsibility and apologize sincerely. Basic stuff, right? Indicate that it's unlikely to happen again and see if there's a way that you can make amends from this, which I think is also something important to recognize if you want to keep that relationship. So the last question I have for you is, given everything we talked about today, what is your biggest takeaway from this chapter and why? And make this a little bit meatier of a question. Don't make this super short either, right? More than a sentence or two here, just 5 or 6. So go ahead and answer that. And with that in mind, thank you all for tuning in today. Here's my announcements again. Just don't forget about that final paper. Stop by office hours if you have any question. If you can't make that office hour, also feel free to just show up during, don't show up during office hours because that wouldn't work for you. Go ahead and make an appointment with me just by shooting me an email. Other than that, if you guys have any questions, you know how to reach me, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye-bye.